Welcome to the studio, it's Vin Jelly here, and this is another one of my castle videos. This time it's going to be filmed in real time, and I've made several cuts so that you're not seeing lots of times where I'm just sitting there thinking. So I've started by drawing out this particular castle, and I'm approaching it with a different colour scheme this time from the previous video and previous paintings that I've done on this theme. So I'm starting with quite a cool application of cobalt blue, and I'll be mixing a bit of Prussian blue in with this. So I'm applying the darker areas to the shadows to try and build the form of the piece, of the castle. So it looks like I'm doing a lot of brush marks here, but actually I'm doing a lot of brush strokes rather than brush marks, and these brush strokes are really pushing and teasing the water around, watercolour. So it's controlling that water and getting it to go where I want it. There's a lot of wet in wet manipulation going on here, and hence the brush marks. The actual movement of the brush is pushing the water around and pooling it. The mop brush that I'm using holds a lot of liquid, and that's really useful for this kind of watercolour when you want to have soft edges and interesting textures that look natural rather than hard-edged and contrived. I can still create a hard edge. As you can see, the edge of the tower is a hard edge, but that's because I've controlled the water to come to that edge. But within the wash area it's harder to control, and you've got to manipulate that liquid. And this is part of the secret of watercolour, really. If you are careful and manipulate the water and get used to pushing the water around rather than just applying the paint flat, you can get more interesting results. And so this is something that it takes quite a while to understand and appreciate, and it's quite a hard thing to explain actually, but hopefully a real-time video with a narrative like this will help to illustrate the point. So actually mixing on the paper a little bit here with a little bit of Prussian blue going into that cobalt blue, and because it's still wet, it's a sort of micro areas of wet in wet rather than the whole sheet being wet, and that means I can control the water and create quite interesting tonal variety by pushing that water and pigment within the water around. I like to leave little areas of white as well, in the traditional manner of watercolour, rather than using white paint. I'm not against using white paint, but I find that a lot of whites aren't that white anyway, and they have their uses, but when you want a clean white, it's useful to learn to leave that white of the paper showing through, and that really gives you the brightest white you're going to get, as long as the paper itself is white to start with. So I'm carrying on with blue here, and the idea is to develop largely the shadow areas in blue. I'm using a slightly warmer brown, a mix of a burnt umber and cobalt blue now, just to warm up some of the darks and add a deeper tone as well. This is part of the building process, and I restrict myself in the early period of the painting to try and develop the shadows and try and develop the form using a very limited amount of colour, and all this blue will affect what goes on top of it. So I like to think in terms of warm and cool. So here you can see a slightly closer view of me pooling pigment, and rather than just brushing it on and letting it dry, I'm actually creating pools from this lovely mop brush reservoir of water that the mop brush has. It's not actually a reservoir other than the volume of liquid that's held in the hairs, and it really enables you to paint for quite a sustained period of time. You can see me dabbing it away with my rag there, to lighten the concentration of pigment within the liquid. So doing that helps me to control the tonality or values, as some people like to call them. I'm leaving quite a bit of white, but a lot of these white areas will be toned down later on. It's just nice to have the contrast at this stage, and knowing that later on they'll be darkened down allows me to see some of the potential contrast within the shadow. So I'm adding a bit of salt here for texture, and then I'll let that dry, and while that's drying I can work on slightly different areas. And I'm using a warmer wash now, which is it's an orange mixed with some of the cobalt blue, and that creates almost a greenish tinge, as you can see. And I've sped up the film ever so slightly here. So whilst it's wet, I'm dropping in more areas of colour, and this all helps to create an underpainting and set the scene tonally. It also allows me to create texture, because the use of salt and dabbing and pushing the water around and dropping water droplets onto the washes will help to create an interesting texture. And it's really essentially abstract painting with watercolour, abstract landscape in these areas. The whole painting isn't really an abstract, it's just these areas are suggested impressions and abstract. So a bit of splatting there going on as well. So where this kind of horizon of blue meets the sky, I'm softening. I've softened the edges there to make it recede with aerial perspective into the distance. And now I'm adding a bit of a different blue, a manganese blue. Whilst the overall effect is one of blue, it's nice to vary those blues. You may have a dominant one like the cobalt, but to have a little bit of Prussian and a little bit of manganese in there really helps to enrich the feel of the blue. So now I'm beginning the underpainting of the sky. It's quite random, but I've got some cloud shapes in mind which hopefully will enhance the composition and will give a feeling of dynamism, and also enhance the backlit effect of the castle, so working into that archway as well. I'm allowing these yellow washes to run onto the building as well, and then a little bit of salt. So I've cut out some of the actual tone. You can see where the salt has made its effect now that it's dry. It takes quite a while to dry, 10 minutes sometimes, depending how wet the paper is. But obviously I'm not going to leave that uncut, otherwise you'd be sitting here watching paint dry. So again, it looks like I'm doing lots and lots of sketchy marks with my brush, but really that is pushing the water around, pushing the liquid around, teasing it into place, rather than just doing one smooth wash mark, which would give a different effect. That has its place, but for the kind of effect I want to achieve, I find that pooling and pushing, as I call it, really assists with creating that. And I can still draw in certain elements of the architecture with some of these darker areas. They'll dry slightly lighter as I go, but it helps to establish the form and to establish the drawing at the same time. So this is a kind of circular opening in the wall, probably some kind of designed window or skylight with some sort of light. I've got a feeling this particular castle is a kind of folly rather than something that was functional. It has that feeling of a faux ruin rather than being an actual castle, but if you don't think too hard about it, you have the same romantic view as whoever constructed Follies intended, and that's one of a sort of romantic castle ruin set within a landscape. Well, I've set this within a very atmospheric setting, with misty hills behind and rugged foreground to suggest moorland, whereas Follies were often set in parkland on big estates. Not always, but quite often. So I'm going more for the castle look and the continuation of my castle theme. It takes quite a while to build up these washes, but there's kind of safety in limiting your palette because things remain under control and you can concentrate quite a lot on getting the tones and values more where you want them than maybe if you introduced other colours early on. And I like to do this. It's a nice restrained approach and gives you a lot more scope later on. So I'm suggesting some of the distant hills. In the final version it appears a little like a distant mountain there at the background, which hardly shows. It's a very subtle wash, very understated, but that subtlety is apparent later on, and it's nice to consider things like that as you go and not overwork areas like that. There's a temptation once you put down a wash like that on the left, the little blue wash suggesting the distant hill, to really work that and make it more visible, but actually it's visible enough. Just that wash you can see against the white of the paper, it's visible and it's distant, and that's atmospheric, and that's what you want rather than overworking things. So in the foreground I've introduced this standing stone just to create a bit of an outcrop. It's almost like the prospect and refuge idea that was used in 18th century paintings as a device of having a prospect, something to look at, a vista maybe, and then the idea of some refuge somewhere within the painting, a safe haven or a cave or something which you could shelter in, which are things that people like to see in landscapes, and this was a bit of an ideal in some of the earlier landscape painting. So again, I'm building up this foreground area to create a kind of foreground. Well, the area of the foreground is separate from the midground and then the piece of land on which the castle is standing, and it's more defined and there's more mistiness down in that valley, just beyond this ridge here at the foreground. So I'm suggesting some of the cast shadow here, cast by the castle itself and also cast by the hill itself. The great thing is with this paint you can dab it out with your cloth, so if you put too much on you can wipe some of it away. Certain pigments wipe away better than others, And the lovely thing about a brush like this is you can draw fairly fine lines with them. So all the time working wet on wet and mixing on the paper, and there I'm glazing over paint that is dry as well, so the red paint is going over dry blue paint, but where I've got some damp brown or red, I can work into that without it becoming muddy. And building up these shadows, making them a bit darker, putting a bit of salt on again. I've cut out a lot of the application of salt part, but I do use quite a bit of it because I do like the texture, but sometimes I'll paint over completely where I've created those textures if it's not appropriate at the time. So now I'm warming up some of the less shaded areas of the castle, and even some of the shaded areas has warmth within it because it's made of this stone, and where the light is shining directly upon it, it's fairly warm. But because I've already painted the blue underpainting, I can glaze warm hues over the top of that, and it will warm up the look of the stonework, even though it was painted coolly underneath, and it will retain that coolness. That cool shadow will shine through. So I've sped it up a little bit now to just speed up as I do a lot of this foreground random brushwork and wash work. Not a lot of it's lost by speeding it up. And this is a bit of a risky application of colours because it is quite contrasty, and while I was doing it I thought it probably would be okay because it will mute down quite a lot, and I intend to paint over it with some sort of greens here and there, and they'll contrast nicely with the reds, so the whole thing should harmonise as I develop it. But this is where you've got to keep your nerve, because at times like this you can think it's all going wrong and start to think you've gone too far. But understanding how the watercolour works and how you can layer and glaze, apply different layers and different glazes, and waiting for things to dry in between, you can control that. And you can, once you know how to control it, you can anticipate what's likely to happen, and then use that to your advantage. So a bit more splashing here and there, and they'll cause little blooms and little dots of paint, all which add to the texture and create varied texture as well. So you see the yellow sky that had gone on. Well, now I'm applying some turquoise, and that sits nicely with and upon that yellow. And even though it's quite strong at the moment, again it will dry a little bit lighter, more muted. But from my previous video, if you watched it, you'll see the colour scheme's quite different. But quite a lot of pigments are actually the same pigments that I'm using. It's just trying to create a different look and yet retain the series theme. A bit more salt again, and wait for it to dry. So now I've mixed a greenish colour using the orange that I was using earlier, and a little bit of cobalt blue and a little bit of Prussian blue, and you can see that the reds are now shining through that nicely, and I'm creating little tussocks of grass and foliage on that hillside as it descends down into this slight valley, keeping it fairly light in places, particularly towards the edges of the painting, because I want the centre of focus to be the castle and archway, to develop in the foreground a little bit more. It's a question of, we're working with slightly abstract landscape like this, building it up so that it harmonises, but it's very useful to have some kind of pattern in mind, some kind of design in mind. So I generally tend to do a pencil sketch first, and sometimes do a preliminary painting, and I see them as practice, really, because they help me to iron out any of the problems beforehand. So using the turquoise again adds a cooler element and creates a little bit of a kind of misty edge where there's not much paint down in that valley. It's starting to suggest a bit of pooled mist, and I'll develop that by wiping out certain areas later on. So I'm just feeling my way and being a bit creative with it and just having fun with the paint. And a slightly closer view of, again, warming up where the sunlight is falling upon that masonry. So against the hard line of the shadow, I'm emphasising that colour a little bit more and just intensifying it. So there's quite a good complementary contrast going on. And now as it moves around away from the light, more into the shadow, I'm cooling it, making it a little redder. So now I'm using the brush to just work into this still damp paint and lift out certain areas to create that misty effect that I was talking about a moment ago. I'm softening the edges of that part of the castle too, and I'm about to soften some of the left hand side of the castle, and this helps to create a bit of a misty impression. So I decided it would be quite a nice thing to have a pathway that led the eye in, and again that's kind of almost a romantic device. And there came a point where I began to think that this painting was reminding me of the work of Caspar David Friedrich, a German painter. His work's very particular, and it's quite almost surreal if you look at it carefully. And there's usually figures or some centre of focus, some architectural feature, quite focally painted against a softer, differently lit landscape. And this began to make me think like that. And although you don't see it in this particular video, I enhanced that look, which you can see in the final shot if you watch till the end, where I add a few birds and also a few remnants of a gate in that archway, either a gate or a portcullis, or just some sticks really that look quite stark, as if they've been destroyed or burnt, or they're just the remnants of them. And adding that little detail gives it much more of a Caspar David Friedrich like look. I wasn't ever intending that, but I was kind of inspired the closer I got to the end of this painting to think along those lines, because I thought it was quite an atmospheric way of finishing it. So So you can see now, working in the shadow and putting some darks in the shadow. Within shadow there's light and dark, and understanding that is a really useful way of enhancing your painting and making it look a bit more realistic than if you just did a solid shadow which had nothing in it, nothing visible in it. We can actually see into shadows unless they're completely devoid of light. There's usually reflected light in there, there's usually a variety of different tones of material in there, and those all reflect light in different ways. And so having variety of light and dark within shadow helps to make your paintings seem more convincing. I mean, something like this is, apart from the fact I used a reference photograph of a real castle, I've changed it rather a lot. I've changed the drawing, the proportions. I've just used it as inspiration, really. But the actual painting looks nothing like the photograph, other than the shape of and the essence of the castle. I've created a lot of atmosphere, I've created a lot of colour that just wasn't there. The cloud shapes are completely different, the foreground's completely different. But that's the fun of creativity and the artistic license, as people like to call it. It's our duty as artists to make more of something and inject interest into it. And I find that very exciting. So you can see as you work along these lines, you can build up and pull and push things to aid the overall feeling and atmosphere of the painting and enhance the composition. And it's all about really directing the eye to that castle and that centre of focus and keeping that in mind, and yet retaining other areas of believability and other areas of aesthetic value. So here I'm using yet more red in this foreground, and it looks quite dark there, but that I'm just adding there is how a bit more how it looked in real life. And again, it fades away quite a lot in the finished item. So here is a bit more of an orangey red going in, and then back to the green tussocks of grass. But having that orange with the red and a slightly pink gives a lot of variety. Like I was saying earlier with the variety of blues, it's good to vary the general colours that you use. So you could say that this painting had blue, orange and green in it. So within that I've varied the greens. I've got a couple of nice greens, 3 to 4 blues, and the orange stroke red pink. I'm using quite a bit of colour, even though it's restricted to certain feeling. But having that variety generates interest. It's good not to have too many vivid, strong colours, but you can use quite a lot of colours subtly to enhance the main overall theme and overall colours that you have applied. Here's a close-up of me doing some of the suggestion of brickwork. It's quite simply done, and then just using my fingertip to soften some of it and take away a little bit of the pigment, and then just not overdoing it but using that bit of colour in other places. So if you've watched the video all the way through so far and you enjoy what you're seeing, please like and subscribe, because that really helps to develop the channel. Anyway, enough of that for now. Going back to the painting, here's another close-up, and I'm putting more darks into the shade. Addition of these extra tones really helps to enrich things, and again, good idea not to overdo this kind of thing. It's very tempting when you see what a difference it makes to just add yet another tone, to go putting it everywhere, and really that's not a good idea, because less is definitely more, certainly more effective in cases like this. So again, I'm just warming up some of these greens, and by putting some pinkish red in there and glazing over it, and that will subtly dissolve down to virtually nothing, even though it looks quite bright at the moment. Just adding a little bit into the sky as well for a bit of variety and a suggestion of some perhaps darker clouds. So you can see that the overall effect of the painting, if you have managed to stick with the video all the way through, is gradually developed and built up by systematic application of paint in each area and building it up until it was develops a nice kind of overall atmosphere. And I more or less had in mind what I wanted to do in order to achieve this, but there's still a random set of effects going on which help create a nice unpredictability about this, even though I have an overall aim in mind. So now, just putting on a few finishing touches, I decided to add a few extra little details right at the end, and you'll see those in a moment, even though you don't see me actually adding them. I added them when I'd stopped recording, and they just add an extra little bit of interest and focus. So here's the final result with the birds and the perhaps damaged portcullis in the archway that reminded me of Caspar David Friedrich. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.